my very great pleasure tonight at the Tolpuddle Radical History School video sessions to welcome Sheila Rowbotham to talk to us and to answer questions tonight from Iris Kaye-Smith. Sheila is known internationally as the leading historian of feminism and radical social movements, and has played a tremendous role in the history of both of those groups. She's spoken at the Tolpuddle History School before. I'm delighted to welcome her back tonight. In a review of her recent book by The Guardian said that they thought that Sheila should be known by younger historians and younger people. And I'm very pleased tonight to be handing over the school to Iris Kaye-Smith. Iris Kaye-Smith is a budding historian who studied at Oxford. She first became aware of Sheila's work as she was writing her thesis on socialist women's movements in 19th century France. And she realized the important and influential role that Sheila's played in British feminism. And I think that's absolutely right. We're going to show you a couple of slides, and then I'm handing over to Iris to take us on. Okay, Nigel's going to post a couple of slides now, I hope.
Yes, this is just to set a bit of context, just how prolific, how important, how influential Sheila has been in the books that she's written that I'm sure will be talked about tonight, but particularly focusing on this one. Hopefully you've seen it, and we'll be giving a plug, available in all good bookshops. But this is the focus for this evening's conversation between Iris and Sheila. So enough from me. Over to you, Iris.
Oh, hi. Hi, it's wonderful to be taking part in this event and asking questions. I thought we could start by talking about Daring to Hope for people who haven't heard about it, or haven't, well, I assume they've heard about it, but haven't read it yet. And can you tell us a bit about what led you to write it?
Well, there isn't really that much done about Britain, which brings in a mixture of sort of memory and background history. There's some oral histories, and there's work by younger academics who've gone back and looked at women's liberation through archives. But there are not that many that I can think of, really, in great contrast to the States, where there are loads. But I personally had a bit of feeling by 2017. I did a book called Rebel Crossings, and I spent years traveling all around in America and in Britain to go to archives, and I just thought, oh, I can't do that. It's too exhausting. So I do have papers in the Women's Library, which are available for people to see, most of them, although they've not all been catalogued. So I used those and my memories, and I had not really journals, I had bits of scrappy stuff. And I sort of put all these together, and I had appointment diaries, and they were really useful for dating things, because even dating women's liberation events accurately presents a bit of a problem, because we don't really have histories with precise dates and things. So I felt as though it was a good thing to do, to get over how it felt, as well as just the stuff that you could read in archives.
So was that related to your first memoir, Promise of a Dream, which is about the 60s? Yes.
I mean, I had done that one a long time ago, and I did that one about the 60s because I got so fed up with people talking about, some people talked about the politics and other people talked about the music and the cultural, radical culture. And they were so interconnected, and it looked as though, to me, people were just wrenching them apart. And I wanted to show that there was a great deal of interconnection. I think the interconnections that come out from Daring to Hope are connections to some of the older women who were in the book, and also the internationalism. I mean, before women's liberation developed as a movement, there'd been movements that involved quite a lot of young women in the 60s, like CND and that campaign for nuclear disarmament, and the people who were demonstrating, like I was, against the Vietnam War. So there was already an understanding that we were linked globally. And the women's liberation movement in the early days were very much influenced by the American civil rights movement, and also the writings of people about Black power in the States. So the American influence was strong, and we had close connections to women in North America generally.
So is that why you think that women's liberation developed as a movement at the time that it did? Do you think those interconnections that you talk about are were the driving force of the founding of women's liberation?
That's such a hard question, I think, because I always felt, doing history, how great it would have been to be there, because then you would really know what happened. But actually, when you were part of a movement which grows, you don't really quite know why it suddenly grows. You know, it was partly because people were pushing groups and saying we should do this and do that, but it was very also exceedingly spontaneous, the response of a lot of women. And the original nucleus of women who got involved were often people like me who'd been through various different aspects of radical politics in the 60s, and also were involved in those movements in the 70s. So we were political and on the left, but the women who were attracted to the women's liberation groups quite quickly were sometimes people who might have gone on CND demonstrations, but some were simply struggling with desperate isolation at home because of the lack of childcare, and having children who they were, you know, constantly with, and feeling frustrated. And I think that was partly because there was more young women who had higher education. So there were a sense that there were alternative possibilities, which other people in earlier eras, it was very much a minority of women. And one of the things that I think differed was that the earlier generation had tended to be forced to either go for a career or to have children. And my generation were kind of bouncy 60s young people who thought we could have both. In fact, I think it proved more difficult than we imagined, but those were some of the basis for women's liberation. But why women's liberation develops in so many different countries round about the same time, there is a feeling that you got ideas because other people were doing them, and rumors were coming over about things that people were doing in America and in France and in Italy. So we heard these rumors, and thought, oh wow, yeah, they're doing it, so we could. And Germany, actually, Germany was another place that we heard about, because there was an international student movement, so that came through. And at the same time, as I bet people here know, trade union women were also demonstrating for equal rights. So the terms were somewhat different, because they tended to phrase it in terms of equal rights, whereas we were influenced by movements which were movements internationally for liberation. So we adopted the term liberation like the Americans have.
That's really interesting, because the women's liberation is often or sometimes referred to synonymously with the term second wave feminism. So it's interesting the way that you frame that as being liberation as being separate to equal rights. Do you think that this idea of waves is a good way for historians to describe feminist movements in the past?
Well, I think in America they did talk about themselves as the second wave quite early on, and that image is stuck. But to a historian, it's a pretty rough kind of image. I mean, as soon as you find out more about history, you discover that the roots of things that pop up in the early 20th century could be traced back to the 1840s. So that women in the United States who had been campaigning about this slavery, against slavery, they were in contact with women in France, which I know you're interested in too, who'd been part of the 1848 revolution. And they were also in the 1840s beginning to assert the women's rights. And equally in the Chartist movement in the 1840s, towards the end of the Chartist movement, there's a minority who were talking about women's equal rights. But as Dorothy Thompson showed very well, the idea of equal rights or equality with men is only one strand of the kinds of movements that women have been involved in. And many Chartist women got involved because of issues around daily life and consumption. And those kind of movements, of course, have also characterized movements in India, Latin America, and many parts of the world in the same period that women's liberation rose. So I mean, if you have a wave that's going on from the 1840s to the early 20th century, it's a bit of a long-term wave. And equally, I think we were quite arrogant when women's liberation groups started to pop up, because we thought we'd discovered everything we knew and nobody else had. And it wasn't until we really dug around and discovered that the past was not necessarily the way it had been presented to us. I mean, when I was a student in the mid-60s at university, we just didn't have any women ever mentioned. And yet I went to a women's college that had been formed by suffrage women, and yet the history that was on my curriculum, it wasn't, I can't think of any particular reference to women. So there was an extraordinary blanking out of stuff that women had done, and also the daily life of women.
That's really interesting, and I wanted to ask you about how important that was for the development of women's consciousness during the women's liberation movement, because you've spoken about some of your comrades who weren't as interested in women's history or working class history, and how do you think the consciousness of historical movements for the historical consciousness of women's involvement in progressive movements helped form your own sense of what women's liberation meant, if that makes sense?
It was incredibly important to me, because I mean, I can't, ever since I was quite young, I've always been interested in the past. But I mean, quite a few friends of mine are not interested particularly in the past, or, in people who were interested in contemporary issues to do with women. We're not all interested in the past, but right from the beginning, there was a little core of women who had close links to Ruskin Trade Union College, as it happens. Sally Alexander, who was a student there, and Anna Davin, who was closely involved with all the history workshops, and was also involved with Raphael Samuel, who was one of the key organizers of the history workshops as a tutor at Ruskin, and the early first sparks of the idea of a women's liberation conference came up because of an argument at Ruskin with a trade union man who said to a woman, a working class trade union woman, that women shouldn't go out to work because of the bad conditions that women faced. And I popped up and argued with him, and then there was kind of a lot of puffing and puffing, and we eventually, a little group went to a student room, and we Anna was there, Sally, and various other people. Hilary Wainwright was there actually, and a friend of mine called Roberta Henderson. So it was a tiny room, and there weren't many of us, but we got the idea from Barbara Winslow, who's an American, that we should not have a conference on women's history, but we should have a conference about women in the present, because there hadn't been such a conference in Britain, and she knew more about the American movement because she was from the States, and also was influenced, as I was, by E.P. and Dorothy Thompson. And although it took quite a long time for both of them to decide that they did support us, they were very dubious about us at first. It wasn't really till the mid-70s when they'd been to India and met quite a few socialist feminists there that they became sympathetic to the idea of socialist feminism or women's movement, because I think, having been shaped by anti-fascism and the war, quite a lot of that generation felt that, you know, the women's issues had really been solved, and they looked at us and thought we had a much better deal than they'd had when they were in their 20s, because it had been the Second World War.
That's fascinating, because obviously E.P. Thompson's idea in the history of the making of the English working class, about what's the phrase, rescuing people from the enormous condescension of posterity. That's something that you do in your writing about women's history and often working class women who are active in politics.
Yes, and Dorothy Thompson too wrote a lot of very interesting things about women in the Chartist movement. I can hear a dog woofing. I'm sure I can hear a dog.
And there isn't a dog here, so I think it's someone in the audience. It was also really interesting to read about your relationships with some of the older women that you met in the 70s, like Dora Russell and Florence Exton Han, and people who'd formerly been suffragettes. How important were those relationships with older feminists? How important were they to you?
Well, Florence Exton Han, I met because I taught in the Workers' Education Association. That was how I earned money. And I went to a class in Stanmore, and my secretary said I should go and see the Hans. Maurice Han had been a trade unionist in Ulster Shop Workers Union, and he was he must have been in his late 80s when I first arrived, and Florence Exton Han had been in the militant wing of suffrage, the suffragettes, and she was in her mid-80s, and I had this picture in my mind still of her sitting in her armchair in her front room in her Stanmore home, and she said, women's lib, you're not interested in trade unions, are you? And of course we'd got this idea that the suffrage movement was not particularly interested in trade unions, because that was a version of history that had been passed on down to us. And people, when they wrote about the history of suffrage, the militants, they focused on the Pankhurst family and not even that much on Sylvia. So we didn't hear much about any contact with working class women. And it was a real eye-opener when Florence said that to me, because she was from a family who were early members of the Social Democratic Federation, and she was involved in Southampton and Bristol as a young trade unionist before she was in the suffrage movement. In fact, it was seen as quite scandalous that they let her, when she was young, go to union meetings in London on the train alone. This is in the late 19th century.
You also talk in the book about your efforts to unionise night cleaners in London, who were often employed on insecure, outsourced contracts in certain buildings. Now that subcontracting and outsourcing is much more common in public sector work, what do you think can be learned from the efforts of yourself and your comrades to organise those workers?
Well, it was difficult. We were approached by May Hobbs, who'd been a cleaner and was keen to try and unionise. And women in International Socialism, they had a women's group in International Socialism, that's the predecessor of Socialist Workers' Party, asked me if I would put a notice around the Women's Liberation Workshop for volunteers to leaflet. And so I think probably about 12 people arrived in my bedroom, which was where meetings were conducted. As women's liberation groups, workshop groups met in people's homes and often in people's bedrooms, because we didn't have very many rooms to ourselves. So that was how we organised. But May sort of got us together, and we did start leafleting for the Transport and General Workers Union. It was very difficult because the cleaners started work at 10, and we would sort of go wandering around the city at 10 o'clock. I used to go with a friend called Liz Waugh, and then we'd sort of run after the cleaners who were tired and they wanted to get, they had to go to work, and they really didn't want us to be telling them about the unions. And some women, because they weren't familiar with unions, they didn't even realize what they were. So we had these sort of leaflets. Then we started to supplement, because they had these blue and yellow T&G things. And we thought we ought to have a bit more explanation. So we started to, at that time, you could write things and then you wound a machine up and you got these kind of copies. So we had these handwritten things that we used to give them about what a union was. And we did get people who joined. The problem was that the bill, when if the cleaning contractors moved the women from the building, we then just lost them. We lost all contact with them. We got slightly more strategic after about a year, and we started to organize women in government buildings, because the Civil Service Union was keen to help and to bring cleaners into the Civil Service Union. And there were several strikes, and it was absolutely fantastic for the cleaners, because I think they were earning about £12 a week in the early 70s. And this, I think the strike pay was something like £10 for the Civil Service Union. So they were getting this money to be on the picket lines. And the picket lines were very dramatic, because it was an official dispute. The lorry drivers wouldn't cross the picket line. So these enormous lorries were stopping, and rumours were reaching us that in the Ministry of Defence, they were running out of alcohol in the bar, which was a bit of a crisis. And so there were some successes in terms of increasing pay, but it was very difficult to sustain it. And really, there were not many of us organising the leafleting. We were down to about 6 by the time we did the Shrew we did an issue of our women's liberation workshop paper, which was called Shrew on the Night Cleaners. And I remember looking around the room and thinking, this is not very many people. And we carried on for 2-3 years. And I think the main consequences of what we'd done was that we really alerted people to the conditions of that group of workers. I remember talking with very well organized trade union people and saying that, you know, there are all these other workers, but they were seen as very peripheral by the unions, and there wasn't a great deal of interest in them. Although by the 1980s, a shift had occurred, and the T&G was getting more interested, I think. So we sort of started in the early 70s, a kind of ripple that went out, but we didn't materially improve the lives of the cleaners, really, in the long term.
So,
but there is a wonderful film
mm-hmm.
by a socialist filmmaker called Mark Carlin, called Night Cleaners, which really brings home the conditions. It's in black and white, and it looks like, I should imagine to somebody now, it would look like, my goodness, this is, you know, back in the days of yore, but it gives a really personal contact with the women who were the cleaners involved in the film. But later on, women's liberation people were involved in 2 ways, because there were attempts to get unions to support campaigns like the abortion campaign, and women's liberation members went into union branches to talk and put the case for supporting the abortion campaign. And the other way was that we ourselves started to be involved in our own unions, which included quite a few people in unions like what was called NALGO, which was the local government's union. And there was a lot of militancy in the unions in the public sector, where people were working for the state, but were critical of a lot of things that they had to do. And that became a really important theme of connection. The other thing was too that the groups like nursery workers, who hadn't really organised, they organised in the 70s as well, and were supported by all kinds of people in the local community, because they knew how valuable their work was and how rare nurseries still were.
I just want to say that I'm going to open up to questions from the audience soon. So if you want to just, if you have any questions, you can send them in the Zoom chat for this meeting, and we'll be able to see them in a bit later. But I want to ask you further about how, because you talked about how it was different trying to organise the cleaners with the civil service union to where the early period when the T&G wasn't very interested. So do you think having sort of centralised institutional support from an established trade union was an important factor in terms of either legitimacy, or in just organising resources and having more time, being able to bring in full-time officers? Do you think that was the decisive factor in those strikes?
The T&G organisers were kind of elderly, and because we were young, we didn't really think it was such a terrible thing to go and support the cleaners by meeting them when they came out for their break at 1 in the morning. But the TNG organisers took a very dim view of this, and I think they thought we were all completely nutty, actually. But the bureaucracy was very difficult to understand for a person like me who hadn't ever had anything to do with union structures. But the civil service union guy happened to be a young person who didn't mind sort of zipping about and appearing at 1 o'clock and talking with cleaners. And I think it was really, the main thing was that there was an added leverage because it was possible to get support within the building. And I think that one of the things that the new groups who've been organising cleaners have found is that you need some extra leverage when a group is very vulnerable. So I think by focusing on groups like the cleaners in the NHS, they've been able to organise more.
Okay.
But I think that it's a general rule that if people are in a very vulnerable position, I mean, it was always recognised you need legislation, like there used to be wages councils and some kind of regulation. And it was always the case that for workers who were not able to have a very strong bargaining position because they were in small groups or they were in very low paid work, that you could helpfully have some extra ways of organising that complemented the union organising.
Do you think the histories of strike action, just thinking about how obviously this is the Tolpuddle Radical History Group, and the Tolpuddle Martyrs are a very important historical case study for so many trade unionists. Do you think that your work in the early 70s is formed a similar kind of watershed moment in the organisation of precarious workers?
Well, I mean, the real militancy was often being women who worked in factories, but who were probably either not unionized or were not active in the union. And those women did get involved in the first half of the 70s in a series of strikes around issues to do with equal pay and equal rights. So the kind of main action was not something that was a campaign from women's liberation. It was things that were going on in the unions, but all the strikes like Trico and Grunwicks and all those sort of the works that have the strikes that have a history show there's a lot of connection between women's liberation groups as well as people on the left and the people who were involved in those strikes.
Okay, sorry, I'm just ad-libbing a bit there because we haven't seen any questions in the chat, but please do send us your questions in the Zoom chat if you have anything you would like to ask Sheila. And I think we're going to hand over to Nigel, if I can do that.
Iris, I was going to suggest that Nigel put those slides up for Sheila to comment on.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, this is me in 1970. This is the next slide is, I think, it must have been, I've seen it over and over again. So I know it's a famous one because Sally Alexander in her Afghan coat is carrying the banner, but I don't know whether it was an International Women's Day march or a union support march. And this one I do know because it was in early December. It was in December 1970, and it was the women's liberation contingent in the demonstration, which was protesting against the Conservative government's attempt to restrict trade union rights. And it was a struggle that went on for quite a long time. I think this was the first, first demonstration, and then later demonstrations came. And the equal pay is not enough, we want the moon is my utopian demand. You can't see me, but I'm underneath that placard. I don't know. Well, this looks as though it was the same this demonstration I see has snow, and that's the clue. So it's 1971, early 1970, spring 1971, International Women's Day. It's the first demonstration, and it had terrible, terrible weather. It was sort of snow and sleet, and there was a group who did a very good sort of dance, which they'd been trained to do by a woman called Buzz Goodbody, who was at the Royal Shakespeare Company. And they danced singing, "Stay young and beautiful through the snow if you want to be loved." And I must say that if you sing on a demonstration and dance, it has a very good effect on passers-by, who all start smiling and nodding rather than sort of staring at you blankly. And this is the 1975, it says there, International Women's Day March, by which time conflict had arisen in women's liberation between women who believed that men should come on marches and women who thought they shouldn't. The original argument for separate women's meetings was the argument that we needed to be autonomous from men, because it was very difficult to work out ideas that we hadn't been able to work out when, because men often would challenge us and criticize us before we'd even sort of worked out what we were thinking.
So we've had one question in the chat I've just seen, sorry, Alison. So this is from Alison, who asks, the reported overload of women with work, family and home during the COVID lockdown made me fear that we have made little progress in the domestic sphere. How do we ensure women, when they spend less time in the physical workspace, do not end up forced into excess domestic labour?
I think we had this idea that there was a sort of optimism that technology would mean people worked shorter hours, and it would be possible to for both men and women to earn enough money working shorter hours and being able to share childcare. And I mean, couples did do that. The problem was that when you were working, two people working part-time ended up earning hardly any money. That was the problem I encountered in my own life with my son's father. We both had part-time jobs, but we hardly earned anything to, so that we were all short of money. I think that it's one of the really big changes that need to be made, because more and more and more women have gone into the labour market, and the situation is really desperate. Mm-hmm. And it affects women of different classes.
Can I ask, go back to the beginning of your talk, really? You said you had links with the women's liberation movement in the USA and France and Germany. How easy were those communications? We weren't in this modern technological age, were we? You didn't have mobile phones, you couldn't use WhatsApp. I mean, how were you communicating with the National Women's Lib movement in America, for example?
Well, with the French, we went on the boat across the Channel to Paris, and then on the train to Paris, and we went on the train to Germany. So we travelled like that, and there was a really strong network of people who were radical students who were sort of drifting about in Europe. And when I went to Germany, actually, when I went to Germany, it was ridiculous because I didn't speak German. I hadn't got any German money. I had a telephone number of a guy who was somebody who'd stayed in our communal house in Hackney in London. I didn't know how to work a German telephone, and I couldn't ask anyone how to do it because I couldn't speak German, and it was a blizzard when I arrived. I didn't have any money because I had to pay an enormous fine because I hadn't got the right kind of, I got a thing called a temporary passport, and I was fined on the train. And I saw a man who looked as though he had rather long hair, so I thought perhaps he'd be friendly. So I asked him, and he turned out to be English and do translations for the New Left Review. So I happened to bump into this person, and so he took me to the place, and we rang this guy who stayed in our house. So he put me up for the week, and basically fed me too because I hadn't got any cash. And I got a plane back, which cost £10, which he lent me. And that was on a student flight. So there was some student flights. In America, it was obviously more complicated. I didn't go to America until 1974. But I was able to give some talks when I got there because my Women, Resistance and Revolution book had come out in America. And so I got paid to do talks, which was amazing because in Britain, nobody paid you to give a talk. So that covered the fare. So that was how we moved around. But we also wrote letters. I used to write those blue airmail letters to American socialist feminist friends.
I think we have a question from Ines as well.
Oh, thank you, Iris. Hi, Sheila. I've really enjoyed this evening and listening to you. I've actually got a bit of a personal question. You were talking about sort of motherhood earlier, and I know in your book you do touch upon it from a personal perspective and how it sort of changed your own outlook on life. And earlier this evening, you sort of suggested that as younger women in sort of in the feminist movement in the 60s and 70s, you thought you could have it all, but how wrong you were. Given the advancements, am I wrong as an expecting mother in sort of 4 weeks' time to think that I could potentially have it all? And what advice would you give? Because I do feel as I think a fellow audience member mentioned earlier that despite all of these advancements, that this concept of being a working mother or being a working woman with children is still not possible, that you almost have to take a back seat in society or in your career before until you finish mothering, and then you can go back and contribute to society. So I'd really love your take and any advice on how we can sort of keep pushing for those advancements that we need.
Yes, I mean, I lived in a house where other people in the house helped to babysit. So Paul, my partner, and I went out. We could go out once a week together because they took it in turns to do it. So I think there was about 3 or 4 other people, so it wasn't too onerous on them. Because as they said, you didn't bring it to the house meeting, this decision to have a baby. And so there were some houses that stressed that everybody in the house had equal responsibility for the children. But I think that was difficult because if that group then broke up, the biological parent could go off with the child, and all the people who'd been helping were left without any right to have any contact with the child. So that's a bit difficult. So we didn't really want to have such an extreme division, sort of constructed division of labour. So that's one thing, that if there's more than two people looking after a child, but it's very hard if there's a couple and then there are more children. I think with one child it's possible to make arrangements and sort things out, but after they're very little. But it's really difficult if there are more. And I must say, I think that the friends that I had who had, say, like 3 children found it really difficult to do very much until the children were older. I mean, just being with a small child is very tiring because they've got so much energy. As I now know, my grandson is 7 now. I'd forgotten how tiring it was. But I mean, people do manage. And I don't know. I mean, I think the problem with childcare now is that it's terribly expensive. Because we had we had these community nurseries which had been started on a self-help basis. So that people just squatted in an old building. And I mean, people would have kittens now, but that's my son went to a community nursery like that was in an old deanery, and he was really very very happy there. And then gradually those nurseries that were set up by people just were able to claim local government funding. But now I think there is more childcare provision, not necessarily full time, but I know my grandson went to a nursery. I think I think there are people here probably who know more about the details of it now. But I think that it is a real problem that money has become the thing that defines how people can get help in our society rather than need. And although it was there were big gaps in the 1970s, the notion that need should be met was something that we could generally assume would be accepted by a wide range of people, even up to sort of liberal Tories. And the erosion of that idea of the responsibility of a society to care for people has had disastrous effects particularly on people. Well, obviously people with any kind of difficulty about working, whether it's because they've got children or they've got to have disability or whatever.
So is the question of how to more equally distribute childcare work dependent on, and this is something you talk about in the book as well, encouraging more male partners and men that people live with to take on more responsibilities in childcare. There's a very famous photograph that I often see reshared on Twitter of Stuart Hall working at the creche at the Women's Liberation Conference at Ruskin. And do you think, I don't know if we still have that culture on the left of encouraging men to do more of the, or in society generally, of encouraging men to do more of the childcare work?
We always had creches too at conferences and meetings, and I'm not sure whether if people can probably say, but I don't know whether that's continued. I think it may have become harder for obviously good reasons. People become much more concerned about the well-being of the children and who's looking after them, whether they're qualified and things. And I mean, we just had these kind of ad hoc creches. And I was involved with one. It was the beyond. We had an idea of trying to bring all the different groups and things together. And we had this conference after Lynn Siegel and Hilary Wainwright, and I did a book called Beyond the Fragments. And we had about 80 something children booked in. But we hadn't sort of made it clear in the publicity, you will not be allowed unless you've already booked ahead. We didn't really think about that. And about twice the number of children came that we'd got booked in. So, I mean, I can remember it was about 100 and something children, you know, and there was me and Hilary's sister Tess and my friend Glowden from Guyvax, and we looked out at this sea of chaos. We did get reinforcements because the teenagers saved the day. The teenagers who went to the conference were a bit bored with the conference, so they quite liked hanging out with the kids, and the little ones thought it was great. So we had a lot of people who were sort of age 14 upward who were running between where the creche was and where the conference was going on. And we had no mobile phones, of course. So they had to run through the rain, these teenagers.
There's another question in the chat from Marigold, who is interested in your comments on the impact of Margaret Thatcher as Prime Minister on the women's movement, and where we are now in terms of women's liberation.
Margaret Thatcher had a disastrous influence on everybody, but the women's liberation movement, or women's movement as we were calling it by then, had got serious splits before really she got to power. So by the late 70s, there were divisions between people who were it was not just really socialist feminists versus radical feminists, and radical feminists putting issues of relationships between women and men to the fore, but it was another group who were called revolutionary feminists, and they felt that men were inherently violent, and the socialist feminists disagreed with them very strongly, and there was a conflict which really made it very difficult to carry on by 79. So we were sort of disintegrating really as any kind of coherent movement, but that women went off and did loads of things. So things like women in film developed, and women's, I would say in the 80s that women's awareness in the trade union movement about women's issues really intensified, and it was on a larger scale in the impact, and that came at the same time as acceptance of issues to do with gays and lesbians too. So the first, in the late 70s, that demonstration that the TUC organized on abortion was an important precedent because it was about an issue that wasn't directly to do with work.
I have a question about that. Can I just get to that for a minute? Was it difficult to get the unions in general to support the abortion campaign? I know the TUC favoured it, but was it difficult to get unions on the ground to support it?
Well, it was about 50,000 people came on the march. Yeah. And that was the late 70s. But I think it had been something that had been building up from the branches, because we were quite sort of evangelical in women's liberation. We used to go around speaking all over the place, church groups and union groups and adult education groups, and we often went in twos because we wanted to break down the idea that it was just some individual holding forth. And that gave confidence to people who were not used to speaking. And people were going in about campaigns. There was a campaign about what were then called family allowances, which was a cash payment to whoever was mainly responsible for the child. It wasn't a vast amount, but it could be saved up if you were really broke. And so you could save it up each week. And we went to speak about that when we were trying to defend that as being a cash payment, because there was a decision to transfer the manner of payment more simply to the man's wage. So that was a campaign that was quite important because it brought women's movement into contact with a lot of Labour MPs and also people who were campaigning generally around issues to do with poverty. There was a definite shift on those issues to do with sexuality, I think, certainly by the early 80s, because I worked at the GLC from 83, and I can remember a trade unionist, I can't remember what union he was from, saying to me, actually, we were worried about having this resolution about gays, but when we actually put it to our members, their attitudes had really changed. And I think that through the 70s and into the early 80s, certainly among younger people, there was a big shift in attitudes towards discussing attitudes to sexuality, which had been taboo before.
Well, thank you so much, both of you. Thank you, Sheila, for your time and answering Iris's questions brilliantly. And thank you, Iris, for your very professional handling of this session. It's been lovely to watch you both working. That's been absolutely fantastic. I can't thank you enough, Sheila. I just think it's a pleasure to listen to you. And the sort of history you're describing in London when I was there and working for the GLC in the late 70s as well becomes very apparent. And I'm very grateful for everything you do. And I'm going to end this session tonight, apart from thanking both of you, and I'm very grateful to you both, with a very brief video about the next session of the Radical History School on April the 5th, Tuesday, the April the 5th, which is going to be about conviction politics. And I'm hoping that Nigel's got a small video to show us.
Can I just say good luck with the baby?
Twins.
What emerges from the 1830s onwards is the mass movement of the working class, although it was more than that, and that is Chartism.
There was a great passion for men of destiny.
The famine was the politicizer, I think.
We're talking about 73,000 convicts, that's a lot.
Although they had been transported for protesting against the British state, they ended up collaborating with the British state.
They were part of a machine, if you like, a machine that was akin in some ways to slavery.
What I see more and more is basically a highly disempowered population who carry the scars of the way this whole place began.
Wow, that looks amazing.
So next month's session will be a very different session. I think we're going to show you 3, 4, possibly 5 very short films, and Nigel Gossey will be interacting with those films and speaking between them. I'm hopeful that's going to take place. I'm sure it will take place. Once again, my very grateful thanks to Iris and to Sheila. It's been a delight to listen to you both tonight. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. And I hope everyone who has been here and looking at the comments in the chat, I'm sure that other people have enjoyed it as well. And I wish you well for the rest of the evening. Thank you so much. Good night.
I wanted to say good luck with baby. I don't know whether my last attempt got through.
Yeah,
I think
saw
there's a
it laughing at
this message. Thank you for the chat.
Yeah, thank you, Sheila.
Bye.
Good
Thank
night, all.
you. Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you.